Coming up, Sean Marks and the Brooklyn Nets continue the rebuild trend, this time taking a flyer on reclamation project Killian Hayes. We break down the value, the potential fit, and what it'll mean for the season ahead, all coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Marmbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. All summer long, FanDuel is hooking up customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every single day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And Doug, just when you think we're not going to have something fresh to talk about on a Friday for the Locked On Nets podcast, we get Killian Hayes' private workout held over the course of the Summer League in Vegas. Nets attended. Sean Marks was there. And then ultimately, what feels like, I've said this and put it into our notes here, a no-brainer. There's absolutely no downside to signing a guy like Killian Hayes to a one-year contract to see if he's a player that could be a part of the mix for Brooklyn.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is the part of what a rebuild looks like. It takes, guys who, at some point were highly valued and his values, been diminished, sometimes lower, sometimes the zero. And you see if you can hit on something. And that's just, what you have to do. And in years past when the Nets did it, it was kind of on the hope that's like, hey, we really need this guy to turn into something. Yes. Like the Nets kind of need this, right? Because especially going into last year, it's like, well, they have very little financial wiggle room and whatever. They need one of these guys to hit. Now the situation is different. It's like, hey, let's just see how this goes, right? Let's take flyers on guys who other teams either need to get off their money, i.e. Zaire Williams, or guys who've just been straight up cut because they're just not part of the situation. But at one point, not too long ago, were a very high draft pick that some people had, speculated could go even higher, and that's Killian Hayes. So I like the signing. Going into last year would have been a little question mark. They never would have done it in the previous years with like Durant and Kyrie and those guys because it wasn't the kind of player. But on the track that they are now, bringing a guy like Killian Hayes, there's no, like you said a few times here, there's just no downside to doing a move like this. These are just the kind of moves you make, and you'll see pretty quickly if it's going to work. And if it doesn't, you move on. And that's fine. And where the Nets are in their timeline, trying this out with as many guys as possible makes all the sense in the world.
Last time we saw Killian Hayes, 2024, 42 games, averaging 24 minutes a game, but also only shooting 41% from the field, under 30%, from beyond the arc. Really saw a massive dip as well at the free throw line, 66% in his final appearance, just giving you under 7 points per game. So we all understand there's a reason why a player like this was available and ultimately was trying to have teams come see him work out ahead of the upcoming season to try to get himself back on track. The one-year contract makes all the sense in the world because if it goes right for Killian Hayes, he can go ahead and start the next chapter of his career, hopefully getting himself back on track when it comes to the offensive end of the court. For the Brooklyn Nets, you mentioned it is a flyer. I'll give my opinion here as well, obviously, but do you think, if you were looking into your crystal ball of the season, that will reflect back midway through and say, hey, they've really found something with Killian Hayes, a guy that had the pedigree, obviously totally bottomed out with the Detroit Pistons, but I don't mind looking at Detroit and saying, well, that's not the organization that any player wants to go to when it comes to developing and maybe sometimes working on areas of weakness. I think that it'd be different if you told me they were on the Golden State Warriors, if they were on Team X, Z, or Y that you think has developed talent the right way over the years. Toronto Raptors would be another good example of this, maybe.
That's a good point, right? It's like if you look at this guy and they didn't make it through a certain system that's known for, player development. It's like, hey, fail with the Heat. It's like, okay, maybe we don't need to go for it, right? Maybe that's the whole story. But when it's with the Pistons, who've struggled to sort of, they fired Monty Williams. He only had 1 year with Monty Williams, but they fire Monty Williams because they just can't put the right combinations of guys in the court. No one's really sort of like outplayed their draft slot yet with that team, but whether it's Jaden Ivey, even Cade to some degree as a number one option hasn't probably all the way gotten there as a number one overall pick. Osser, we'll see. But Ian Stewart, Jalen Duren, these guys are okay, but is anyone like super outperforming where they were taken in the draft? I think you could say no. And if you look at it sort of holistically as the whole team, and you say, like you said, if you're coming from a system that hasn't really developed anybody, maybe relative to where they should have been based on pedigree and based on where they were taken in the draft, and a lot of these guys weren't necessarily, controversial picks. I mean, some people like Killian Hayes higher on the board.
Yeah.
Then, they're taking huge L's off that, but some had him lower. He was a pretty divisive guy or polarizing guy, but in general, if you're trying to tell yourself a story about, why you can do this, it's like, the Pistons just haven't really gotten this right for a long time. And we see some very correctable things. I mean, can the shooting, some of the shooting mechanics get changed here a little bit? Can we boost the confidence a little bit more? Can we lean into things that he does really well, like defend, super long wingspan? Like, is he a guy that could look okay against, like, next to Cam Thomas? Right? Like, maybe.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of different stories you can tell here. And if you're specifically looking at organizationally at teams, again, that just didn't get this right or just couldn't play or evaluate, even though the people have changed in the front office. Nets did this with a couple, they did this with Spencer Dinwiddie. They did this with Bruce Brown coming from the Pistons. Pistons were like, no, thanks. And Nets were like, yes, please. And they turn those guys who are super rich now, right? Because they just had a lot of game in them.
Yep.
So there's a lot of, I don't think there's a lot of stuff you can look specifically at Killian Hayes and be like, like this is a home run move. No. But if you look organizationally and just say, they don't maybe have all their stuff together over there, why not take a flyer on a guy who thought, was a pretty clear top 10 pick when he got drafted? Like, yeah, let's just go for it. We can give him some core time and put him in a new system with a new development and see how it goes.
And while no one would accuse, as we said at the top there, you mentioned Miami Heat. That's a great example, right? No one's going to accuse the Brooklyn Nets of being the Miami Heat in terms of developing talent systems. However, as you mentioned there as well, when it comes to taking other discarded players from other teams and reclamating value out of them, that is something that under Sean Marks, the Brooklyn Nets have certainly done. By the way, just 22 years old. That's the other big factor here. Coming up in a second, let's talk about the stats. Let's go back to his days in France and see whether or not we believe offensively he can reset some value for himself. And what does it look like to fit into this team? I'll even make the case that he's an example of trying to get away from Ben Simmons' minutes. Here we go, coming up next in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, we'll tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Look, you love sports. We love them so much. We never want them to stop all during the summer. Sometimes you can feel it slowing down a little bit. Not over on FanDuel, where they got the MLB action going every single day. And when I say MLB action, we're not just going, who's going to win, over under on the runs. No, folks. We're going to slice and dice this way. Thing every which way, strikeouts, total bases. You parlay some of it together. Home runs. You get a couple guys hitting home runs. You try to really spike the nuts in terms of a bet. FanDuel has it going for you all summer long. They're also hooking up all customers with a booster or bonus daily. There's something for everyone every single day. Head on over to FanDuel.com. Start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about Killian Hayes signing a one-year deal with the Brooklyn Nets, we also go ahead and remind you that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on the Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with all the local experts of Locked On. Plus, our national shows are covering every league as well. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. All right, so listen, I'll go right into the meat and potatoes of it. I mentioned it there. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but sort of not. Ben Simmons has been a mess for the Brooklyn Nets. He's had a lot of struggles. He's had a lot of injuries. There's things that are his fault. There's things that aren't. That's fine. We don't need to relitigate what has worked and not worked for Ben Simmons as a Brooklyn Net. But if I'm thinking about this backcourt and taking flyers on guys, and we've mentioned before, hey, you've got veterans still here. Maybe they'll get traded. The front court has a lot of depth and established track record guys. We just talked about Bogdanovich on yesterday's episode. If I'm taking flyers on guys that struggle offensively and can't shoot, I'll go ahead and throw a guy who's 6'4" with a 6'8" wingspan that maybe could be the right type of complement next to a Cam Thomas in this backcourt, because at least I can squint and see a guy that still will go at the rim, that still can handle the dribble and work into the paint, things that no matter what Ben Simmons once was, he clearly is not anymore. And these are not apple to apple players. I understand that. Let me make it very clear. But you are talking about trying to find complementary value that maybe lives beyond this year. And Ben Simmons does not live in Brooklyn beyond this season. We all understand that. And that's where I think a non-offensive player, an offensive player that struggled like Killian Hayes, is worth a flyer for that specific reason when you think about who's going to be here beyond this year.
Yeah, well, okay, first you just want to start by, again, like getting younger, right? You want to just make sure you're just getting, we're not taking flyers on guys that are, even in their high 20s, right? Because mid to high 20s, because what's the point? There's not going to be any timeline where it makes any sense anyway. So you're just like basically eliminating that cohort of player right out of the gate in terms of like who you're even interested in, unless they're already on the team. And the Nets seem very incentivized to get these guys all off the team sooner than later. Cameron Johnson, DFS. We'll see about Bogey. We'll see about Schroeder, all these guys, how many actually survive the season. Simmons, I think we can pretty definitively say, like you said, is not going to be back next season. Not a hot take even in the slightest. So when you're just trying to trend younger, okay, great
news.
That's a great place to start. Also, again, if you do see Cam Thomas as like, you're at least, let's say 3 year guy, right? Like maybe
one
not
more
the future,
at least the contract. At least going to give him the contract.
An extension, and a rookie extension, and go from there. If you're trying to put your best foot forward on guys who project to possibly play well next to him, you do need to have guys who can play defense, right? Like you're going to need that, preferably have length at point of attack. You're going to need that. I mean, obviously it would be nice if they can shoot. Killian Hayes can't do that right now. So that's TBD. And I got a pretty big sample size on that. So I'm not sure how much that comes all the way back around, but yes, if you're trying to sort of like draw it up about a guy who at least makes sense next to a guy who could be backcourt of the future kind of guy for you, you do need a guy like this, right? You just can't have, you really can't have a lot of different, it's so hard with a undersized shooting guard to have a point guard who's also just like not good at defense and like, and just like not amazing like that, because it's just not really going to pair well. We already see how that has sort of worked for Brooklyn too. So again, in like a lab, if you were trying to draw it up and his name wasn't Killian Hayes, you would start at least with these metrics around the kind of guy he is. And then look, there's reasons these guys are on the waiver wire. Like it's not because he's awesome. It's going to take some time to sort of reclimate this project. But again, you're at least starting from the right place, as opposed to say like Jacob Gilliard, right? Who was in summer league. Yeah. And it's like, well, what's the point? Fine. He's a nice player. He's just super small. It's never going to work with the guys they have. At least with this, you can dream about a little upside where some other guys, you can't even dream about the upside. I guess that's the way I'm looking at it.
No, it's a great example. You mentioned Gilliard, and it's not to put him down, but it's the idea of, hey, listen, we know what the floor has been with Killian Hayes. It was in the basement. He was let go from the Detroit Pistons, right? Like, we understand that. But if you dream on the ceiling, there's just certain things as a baseline that make it possible for him to be a better player. You can go look at Gilliard's stats in summer league and say, hey, offensively, he's knocking down some threes. Look at these percentages. You should definitely want to give him a shot over Killian Hayes. No, you don't. Because when guys have a pedigree that get them into the draft and get them drafted as high as they were, there's a reason for that. And it's interestingly enough, because you have to go back to, it's like, when can you go back and find a good sample for Killian Hayes? Dude, it's just 2019, 2020, when he's playing in the Euro Cup. You got a 10-game sample size when there is a player. And I say this like humorously because you have to go back beyond the NBA to find a really good sample. But there's a player that at one time was giving you 27 minutes a game, knocking down 45% from the field, knocking down 39% from deep on 4 attempts per game, and was giving you 6 assists per game and 3 turnovers. So a 2-to-1 ratio. Like, that player exists somewhere inside of Killian Hayes. That player does exist. Will he ever get back to that point at the NBA level? Well, guess what? Competition level is higher, right? Defense is better. So it's not going to be this 1-to-1 of just get him back there. But if there is a version of that can re-exist for Brooklyn and that giving you almost 13 points a game along with the defense, it comes back to what you talk about. Hey, would I like if I could take the defensive value of Killian Hayes and put it into Cam Thomas? Of course I would. I want all of it in one package.
But if be number one pick. He'd be a number one pick.
Exactly, right. Yeah, exactly. And short of that, I'll take having those components in players on my team. And you can just start right there with, if you're going to hope on it, you hope that when the opposing team comes down the court and Cam Thomas and Killian Hayes are sharing it, walk the dream with me, go, Killian, go get him. You take the number one threat first and hide some of my defensive deficiencies for this possession. Likewise on the offensive end. Guess what? You go over on Crafted NBA. The reason why I bring up Ben Simmons is because when you think about the offensive value, guess what? They both stink in all the same categories, and they're both pretty darn good in similar categories. 98th percentile for Killian Hayes in terms of passer rating. 100 percentile, by the way, for Ben Simmons. Like, that's how good he is. And that's how bad he is at so many other things that he can't be a valuable player on the offensive end. But those elements are there. And when you have a guy that wants volume shooting and is shown he can be creative with the ball in his hand like Cam Thomas has, hey, guess what? I'll take a flyer on a guy that probably wants to step onto the court and say, how do I set the table for others? How do I get other people great opportunities here and take some pressure off defensively? It's all dreams. These are all things you dream on, but it's why a one-year signing like this is so easy to make. Same thing with Zaire Williams and getting him. We talked about that the other week, right? Like, all these guys, there's no downside to seeing if they can be something for your team in a year when you know wins are not the most important thing.
And the thing, like, this is almost like, honestly, the situations like this are like sort of analogous to playing fantasy sports, because in fantasy, like, let's say redraft, right? Mm-hmm. It's like you can just feel okay. Like, there's certain, as opposed to, like, let's say dynasties, like, in the Nets are like more of a redraft standpoint here, because it's like, oh, it doesn't work out. No worries. See ya. Yeah. You know, like, we'll just try someone else. Like, there's someone else on the waiver wire. When you're in a different kind of situation, you hold on longer. Maybe you drafted someone, so you have draft equity. You have sort of like the draft equity sort of wrapped up in a guy, so you kind of hold on longer. You're at a different point in your timeline where it's just going to look really bad to drop a guy. Like, there's all these other narratives that can go into it. Unlike, let's say, a fantasy situation where it's like, hey, I'll try this guy. No, not that good. I'm off to the waiver wire.
Right.
We'll grab someone else.
I'll drop you next week.
And I hate to say it like this, because these are guys and, like, these are their livelihoods, and I get it. And I'm not trying to diminish the part where it's probably really hard for these dudes, especially a guy like this, where it's been, not that great.
Pedigree, expectations, and then downfall, for lack of a better term.
Clearly it's a huge L, based on where he got taken. But from the Nets standpoint, they can kind of run this in the short term, like this kind of like fantasy situation, because the stakes are much lower at this end. Like, you can afford to make the mistakes. It's okay to just kind of cut bait and go with another guy. There will be other guys available like this, because teams need to move on from guys. You can't do this forever. You have like a 2 to 3 year horizon on this kind of thing before it just drives fans absolutely crazy, and they'll rightfully stop buying tickets and tune you totally out. Yes. So you can't do it forever. But in the short term right now, you can do it and feel fine about it, because you do not have, there's not a lot of sunk cost fallacy going into moves like this, as opposed to having drafted them or stuff like that.
So much similar here from last season, when it was different expectations going in, but you brought in guys like Baisley, you brought in guys like Watford, right? You kept taking these flyers on young guys, hoping for one to hit. It's another great example, but now there's more of an opportunity for any of these young players to get real run and hopefully develop in a positive way, whether it's here for Brooklyn ultimately or somewhere else. Coming up in a second, what does it mean for the roster? Let's look at the backcourt. Listen, this is a flyer guy. The Nets had a full roster, so who's going to be on his way out? We'll dive into that and what it means going forward for Brooklyn to close out today's episode in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Gametime. Look, we said already with the summertime, with the baseball going on all summer. You want to get on that MLB action, you have to start over at Gametime. They got so many tickets available, especially in the New York area. Just coming up this weekend, you got Braves coming in to visit the Mets. Tickets starting as low as $9, $30 for over the weekend, $20 for Saturday. You're not going to beat these prices like you got going at Gametime. And Gametime's got the ticket buying experience down to a T. They got last minute deals, flash deals, zone deals. They got all in pricing, the seat views. So you're going to see exactly what you're going to see when you sit down in your actual seat. And you'll love this. They have the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Got to do that math in your head, and you're going to know it's a good deal. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account. Redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets. Lowest prices guaranteed.
Oh, so as we tie a pretty little bow on today's Locked On Nets episode, Killian Hayes in the building for the Brooklyn Nets. Now, I did mention the Nets still had two-way contracts to give out. They had filled the roster with their 15 roster spots. So when we duck inside this thing, who is your first odd duck out? They just gave Keon Johnson the contract. You assume is only partially guaranteed for the first year. Maybe this all falls into the swarth. We still have months before the actual season happens, so a lot can change here. Is it more indicative of Shake Milton not long for this roster, or that there's probably, as we started to round ourselves into thinking, more veteran trades coming here as we progress our way through this offseason? Like, it just, you and I thought maybe they'd be willing to, and I think they are, to go into the regular season with some of these veterans. Yet, to keep adding more and more young reclamation projects, it just feels like that old tank agenda. The Brooklyn Nets are taking it very seriously. They are taking it very seriously in terms of clearing out some, quote unquote risky talent on this roster.
Look, we also don't know all that. We're doing this really early. I mean, we're doing this basically right after they did this deal, so we don't even know the details of the contract. It's a 1-year contract. We don't even know if it's fully guaranteed, right? Like the early talk was he'll compete for a roster spot. That could mean that just it could be non-guaranteed, and we'll see how it goes. I'm not exactly sure. We'll know in the coming days exactly what it looks like.
So let me clarify, and it's good by you. More projecting forward, were he to gain a roster spot, who are they going to have to clear out in order to accomplish that?
Yeah, the reason I preface that by saying is because there's a few other situations we're just like not 100% clear on. Like we talked about Bogdanovich yesterday, and that money's not fully guaranteed for this season. So we'll have to see sort of like where he lands on making it all the way through. I'm not sure Shake Milton is like fully under contract right now. Like according to like one source, he's not. So this is where it's just like gets a little confusing, or it's not just like totally guaranteed all the way through. I just think there's a few pieces of information we just don't have yet. And if we miss something, I mean, for sure, just leave it in the comments. Like sometimes this stuff is, it just gets reported in weird ways where it's like done, but it's not finalized and it doesn't hit certain sources until it totally is. So,
and these things stay semi-open in case something else comes up and all of a sudden deal X becomes expanded into more teams or more, more moving parts come into a lot of this stuff, not even around the Mikal Bridges trade, but just future trades that could come up here as well for Brooklyn.
I think like a general rule of thumb here is the older you are, the less likely it is you're going to be on this team. Right. So I think like, not to, understate it here, but I just think they're more inclined to try to get off some of these guys. Obviously, we already know Cam Johnson is on the trade block. We know DFS on the trade block. It's like a little weird because I thought there were situations where those could be sort of like 2-for-1 money deals coming back where the Nets would have to keep roster spots open to make sure that they were able to do it. But that doesn't seem like it's going to be the case. It's also why I'm just curious what the exact sort of numbers and figures around this Killian Hayes contract really are. And if it's fully guaranteed, I really doubt it is. And so, again, we're just going to have to find out. So I'm not exactly sure. I don't actually feel totally comfortable even making a guess about it, except to say the younger you are, the better chance that we play the string out. As opposed to just like, that's where like guys like Shake Milton who are 27. I mean, even that's like kind of too old for this team.
Of course.
Right. So like, that's where you can probably start moving on, especially if you brought in another point guard in Hayes.
Right. And you'd probably have to say something like, to your point, am I going to put my name on it right now that Killian Hayes is going to XYZ with the Brooklyn Nets this summer, this upcoming season? No, maybe he won't even be on this roster on opening night. But if you put him side by side with Shake Milton, you would say, look at the age. Unless you come in, Killian Hayes, and shoot 10% from the field and 4% from beyond the arc, there's just such a low risk in trying to see if you can get something out of him. And that's actually probably, and we'll hear about this more, what I'll find fascinating. What did Sean Marks see in Killian Hayes when they had the private workouts? What do they maybe know of him going back to Detroit, right? What is the sense around things they think are correctable or not? How willing are they to go with figuring out if he can be fixed? Because again, it's not hard to say, well, I'll take all year. I'll take 82 games in 2024, 2025 to see if Killian Hayes can be fixed. And if he can't, it doesn't harm us, really. It doesn't harm our bottom line in any way, shape, or form. So I would be more surprised that they would look at him for a month and a half, 2 months, and go, oh, it's not worth it. Let's cut him loose before the regular season, as opposed to Shake Milton, where whatever he is or isn't, you just say, yeah, well, why keep him around? And by the way, it extends to everybody. Dorian Finney-Smith, Cameron Johnson. It's not that we don't know what they are. It's not that all these guys don't have better and more established ceilings than Killian Hayes. It's just that maybe he can be. And we also know what the agenda is we're trying to serve here. So as you think about those numbers and the way contracts line up, I do find it interesting to see where all of those veteran players land. And then we'll get details about Killian Hayes too. But the last thing I will just mention here for Killian, if you want to, I'm putting out the positive things that we can for him. His rim frequency defense is very strong in the 92nd percentile in terms of impacting opposition shots on the defensive end. He's also strong in terms of defensive turnovers created, 89th percentile, and he's in the 74th percentile when it comes to defensive deflections as well. I'm not going to highlight the offensive side of the ball other than his ability to create for others. He is in the 70th percentile in terms of creating open shots for teammates. That's what he does well on that end of the floor. Hey, those are the positives. There are defensive positives here. And if you go and compare him to a lot of players around the NBA, I think there's some element of whatever happened in Detroit. I think he wore out his welcome just by his play alone, but also around expectations or frustrations. And sometimes these are really good opportunities for former high expectation players to have that time away and go, okay, best thing for me to do is come in, put in the work, and show that I am better than what maybe the tape had for me over the last 2 and 3 seasons.
Yeah, and I think we'll close it out here. But I think you said the best at the beginning was like the most important thing in these situations is to just look where they came from, right?
Yep.
Look where they came from and decide for yourself if you think that they had their best chance to put their best foot forward in those situations. Detroit has been horrible for years, and well under expectations, even when they were kind of trying, right? And so if we're just going to take guys, or if the Nets are just going to take guys from different situations, these are the ones that you want to just try. These are the ones where you feel like if there was something missing, there probably was something missing, right?
The Nets might have the most first-round picks on their roster in the entire NBA by the time we start the regular season. So watch your backs, NBA. I mean, think about that.
And there's a reason they were available. There's a reason they were available. Don't leave that part out. But I just following the theme of this summer so far, what the Nets were doing. I mean, couldn't have really drawn it up better, at least in terms of the sort of archetype of player, or the story around a player that we've been wanting to kind of see them add. Killian Hayes definitely fits along with that. So overall, cool week for the Nets. Probably more to come. It seems like the news never stops all summer long. Neither do we. 5 days a week, all summer long.
Look at us
during the offseason. Name another Name another show about the Nets that's doing that. Here's the thing. There's a lot of good ones. No one's even close.
Yeah.
No one's even close. Sorry. They do good jobs when they show up, but no one's even close in terms of the overall output. You make sure you get every episode. Subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot. Why that is Harrison Ford as Henry Jones Jr.
He's still alive, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, man, he's crushing it.
All right, good, man. Whew, that was a close one. One of the all-time great poets. We're back again. I wouldn't know. One of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking. Felt like he was dead. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. He's starring on Shrinking on Apple TV. Basketball.
Okay,
Yeah. No, be quiet. Basketball. Yeah.